So I just wasted like 20 minutes trying to go live, trying to get my YouTube channel to connect, and it's still not working right. Here in Costa Rica, we just had Costa Rica Independence Day when Costa Rica was emancipated from Spain back in the 1700s, I believe it was, along with every other Central and South American nation, including Mexico. So everybody in San Jose comes to the beach. I come here to Tamarindo, and when they do that, it kills the bandwidth. And I thought for sure, being that almost everybody's back at work today, I would have bandwidth to go live, but I don't. So I need to talk a little bit about something that's been on my mind and heart all day. I've been kind of like just broken over it. Um, and it kind of echoes with what I've been reading with Jill. I had to take the weekend off and not think about the Duggars in any way, shape, or form, not read the book, not nothing. Because this book has been extremely um, triggering. And I just can't handle that right now. Trying to work on my health. I've been exercising for insane amounts of time every day. Today was an hour and 40 minutes. So anyway, let me get started on this. If you don't know who I am, I'm Suzanne Titkemeyer. I used to have a blog, well, a column they called it, a daily column at a place called Pathos. And the name of my daily column was No Longer Quivering, and it had to do with the quiverful movement and evangelicalism in general, the kind of non-denominational, high-demand religious organizations that many of these non-denom evangelical churches actually are. The kind of church that I used to go to, I went to one that called itself a Christian fellowship, not a church, and it was a wild, hot mess. That's all I can say about it right now. I am still unpacking what it is that I think about my old church, and that's what's taken so long with my book. I'm remembering more and more crazy things all the time, things I haven't thought of in 20 years. So I started reading Jill's book. I've read a bunch of it leading up to the weekend that I'm getting ready to talk about. But this morning, I was looking at Twitter, and one of the news sources that does LGBTQ news, that I guess I must follow them because they showed up on my Twitter. They were talking about the Barbie movie. Now, I haven't had a chance to see the Barbie movie. It was here, but it was here in Spanish only, and I couldn't cope with that. I mean, I understand a great deal of Spanish now, but my understanding is not good enough to do a whole movie. So I said, well, okay, I'll sit back and wait. Even though my daughter had contacted me and said, you have to see it. You would love it. You would love it because I know, Mom, that you hate the patriarchs and the way the patriarchal society is set up in the U.S. and many other places. So you will love this movie. And after reading about it, all I can say is I'm sure I will when I finally do watch it. So this place was writing about the other Barbie movie they said that you should watch, which is a movie called Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story, and it's filmed by a independent filmmaker, and all the parts are played by Barbies. Okay, which was utterly strange. But I watched it this morning, and I was looking at some stuff online about poor Karen Carpenter. If you don't know who Karen is, and let me just say this before I get into any of this. These are all my opinions. I'm not stating them as 100% it's a fact. To do your own research, as Rudnell Smith says. And don't believe anything I'm going to talk about today. So this other Barbie movie that they were saying was worth a look. And that Karen Carpenter was an unsung gay icon, which I found to be a little strange, especially since, as a Mata Hoople superfan back in the day, I was horrified when the Carpenters did an interview where they mentioned Mata Hoople in particular and called them out for being messy on stage and stuff. I was like, girl, do you know what glam rock looks like with the high boots, the silver hair, and the fingernails in different colors? Obviously not. So Karen Carpenter, For you youngins that don't know who she was an amazing singer. Her brother, Richard, was a pianist, or he is a pianist because he's still alive. And Karen had problems with self esteem, with her body, with other people telling her about her body and what she needs to do with it. And she developed anorexia nervosa, and that's actually what killed her. She died of heart failure at 32 years old. It still astounds me. Such a great voice, famous all over the world, had it all, but had one of the world's worst marriages and had some really bad ideas about herself. Well, after watching the movie and looking around the online thing, I saw an article in the Village newspaper. You know, the villages in Florida, if you don't know what the villages are, they're a huge faux town in central Florida, in the smack dab middle of the state. It's all these old retirees playing bingo and swinging with each other, and there's bars, restaurants, and all kinds of things. Any kind of activity you could want, they have there. Every now and then, my husband starts making noises about moving to the villages, and I'm like, oh, hell no, I would never move there. Well, the Village's newspaper, that retired psychologist who wrote a piece back in the 2010s sometime about Karen Carpenter and her anorexia nervosa. And a licensed clinical person, this guy was, said that many of the things that she struggled with the anorexia nervosa and the low self-esteem, were likely the result of childhood trauma or possible SA. And I was just heartbroken when I saw that. I didn't really like the music of the Carpenters, but I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. Like I said, I have been SA'd. It happened to me. My first husband was quite abusive, so I've been through some really heavy trauma with all those things in the past. And some of the claims that I saw when I was doing some research on this, there is a gossip site where they do blind items, Crazy Days and Nights, I believe is the name of it, that did one of their things. They said stuff that it made it sound very much like they were talking about Richard and Karen Carpenter, and it was just horrific. It was the most horrific thing you could imagine. It was kind of like what Jill Duggar went through, but continual, and it just went on and on for years. And when she died, it was still going on apparently, or it had recently stopped. But they were claiming, and again, I'm not saying this is God's honest truth because I don't know. I read this at what was the name of that site? There was a site. Let me pull it up real quick if I can without losing the connection. There was a website, and I'm going to link it in the description, that talked about this. It talked about how she had been handed out like candy to record producers, to people so that they could get a recording contract, and to just whoever else is struck her, this person's brother's fancy, to hand her out to. This website is alleging that the secret was about the Carpenters. Again, I don't know, but I do know that Karen's problems with anorexia and low self-esteem feel like they have to be rooted in some kind of significant trauma, some kind of significant ongoing trauma. So I don't doubt it might be true. I just can't say for certain it is. Right now, it's just a rumor on Crazy Days and Nights and a few other websites that I was looking at. So what does this have to do with Jill and myself? Well, during my first marriage, one of the things that happened in that short little time frame, besides the fact that I was in a band with various people, is that my ex tried to give me out like candy to various famous musicians and the like. And I resisted. I never did it. I got my ass kicked for that. I got severely uh, beaten every time he got drunk. He said he didn't remember it the next day and it was always apologetic. But one of those times we went to the Brill building to talk to some songwriting duo or combo or whatever, some manager, I don't remember. It was way back in the mid 70s. And it didn't go well. And my ex tried to hand me off again to somebody, and I was like, no, again. So I knew I was gonna catch hell once he got home. And he had a few drinks in him. I was gonna get belted about. Okay. So with us in the elevator was a famous girl group from the mid 70s. And he started just running his mouth at them, saying awful things and calling them different filthy names and saying that they were unnatural and unfeminine and various things. And I was just looking at the floor in the elevator crying, waiting for the ride to be over with. And at the very end, I made eye contact with one of the girls in the group and said, I am so sorry. I am so, so sorry. And she looked at me and said, why? It's not your fault. You should get away from that guy. That's what she said. You should get away from that guy. And I did. Once the bruises healed, once I could walk, I left with a baby under one arm and a suitcase under the other. That was when I ended my very short marriage. So there you go. You know the story now. So I can relate to this stupid rumor and saying handing her out like candy. Because someone else tried this on me for similar reasons. And it didn't work for us. Every time he tried, I was just extremely resistant and never went down. So it never worked for us. But I can see if you are younger than the other person and you're impressionable, that you might go along with that, particularly if you're applied with drugs, which I don't doubt at all happen. So I've gotten to the point in the book where the whole thing has come out about Josh S.ing Jill and her sisters, and Jill has talked about wanting to kill herself and the illegal release of records. She wanted to unalive herself, but she just wanted to bury her emotions and not have to deal with any of this. And how embarrassing it was. So incredibly embarrassing. And that I can understand. But here's the thing, Jill, you have nothing to feel embarrassed about. Nothing at all. So they were asked, after all of this, they had been asked to do ministry in El Salvador, okay? And she was thinking that was a good way to get the heck away from everything going on with the records release and with the whole world knowing that she'd been SA'd as a child. So when they were asked to commit to staying with the El Salvadorian mission, they were asked to commit and stay from December to July with no returns back to the States after they had already been, part of the ministry and been sent back and forth, shuttled back and forth several times, and saying that journalists chased them around, all of that. And this is post Ashley Madison too. So every time something would come up with Josh, Ashley Madison would be quoted. I would come up. It happened. There was a lady who was an adult film entertainer by the name of Danica Dillon. I think that was her stage name, was it? Or was it her real name? I don't remember exactly, but Danica Dillon was trying to sue Josh, saying that he roughed her up and that he was supposed to pay her for horizontal fun times twice, and did not pay her near what she was asking, apparently, and really roughed her up. So Derek and Jill decided the best thing for them in the light of all of this going down, is to stay in El Salvador. They set up a 501c3 charitable entity so that they could fundraise to keep paying their way there in El Salvador, because every ministry in the world, if they take you on a foreign ministry tour, they take you in a foreign ministry, you have to be able to support yourself. I used to support kids staying at the Spring Valley, what's it, Spring Valley campus of what was the name of that place? I'm sorry, I'm full of allergy drugs. I did a stupid thing today. I did a 140-minute, I mean a 1 hour and 40-minute swimming in the pool and moving around and walking and stuff. So my allergies are bothering me. I'm rather over toasted a little bit, the whole 9 yards. I am full of pills right now. So there were people with global expeditions that I supported who were there as high school graduates who had graduated from high school and were told that they could take reduced fee classes at one of the community colleges while they were volunteering for global expeditions. So I would support kids doing that. That's what a 501c3 charity does. They handle that kind of money. And Jill and Derek asked Chad, the PR guy that Jim Bob had hired, to fundraise and to work with TLC over the new show in order to get them a better contract if possible, to get them money, whatever. But things weren't going real well in El Salvador, and I need to talk a little bit about that. There was the gang violence worsened once they got back from the December to July thing, and that is not really surprising. They had to hire armed guards. That's not surprising either. Here in Central America, this kind of stuff is more common than you would think. Now, Costa Rica is relatively safe. There's just a whole lot of petty crime. What do I mean by that? Twice my garbage can has been stolen. Twice! And it was not anything, the last time it was a beat up old thing where the wheels had popped off. They still stole it. That's what I mean. It's petty crimes of opportunity where people will shoplift. People will take your stuff if you put it down and you don't pay attention. The Do It Center in Guanacaste is notorious for people who will go through your stuff. I had an incident where someone went through my drug bag that I bring with me when I travel. But places like El Salvador have a real problem. And El Salvador, I forgot how far back it was, maybe 6 months or so, put together a militarized police force kind of group to deal with the MS-13 gang members. And they made the violence worse because they were the violence on top of these guys. So they got a lot of them in prison. They killed a lot of them. But I still wouldn't go back to El Salvador. It's quite violent right now and quite unsafe. So they're there years ago when it wasn't quite as unsafe as it is right now. And they are hardly the only place that's like that in the Central America. You have Guatemala, where they had a recent presidential election and members of some of the presidential parties were assassinated. You've got cartels in Mexico. We have cartel violence here in Costa Rica. I was really freaked out. We had a cartel shooting in Tamarindo here that was covered up because the police cover this stuff routinely. I look at Nicaragua, where I have to go make my border run tomorrow. It got put off. And we walk into the building, we walk outside and turn right around and come back in through the other door. That's how violent Nicaragua has gotten. We stayed there 6 years ago before this latest bout of violence, but now there is so much militarization of the political thing there that if you say anything about the government, you can be an American citizen and they will still take you off. And people do get executed and all sorts of horrible stuff has happened. The entire middle class has fled. There's no doctors, nurses, lawyers, anything like that in Nico right now. And it's just a bad situation. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that Jill is talking about this in her book. But it's kind of a fact of life here. You have to be where you think is the safest. Belize is relatively safe compared to a lot of the countries. Um, Costa Rica, Panama are relatively safe. But most of the countries here have a pretty hardcore amount of violence. She's talking about the escalation of the violence and how she had to hire armed guards. She said they kept hearing nearby gunfire. She was hiding in a closet one time when they were doing a women's Bible study, and nearby gunfire happened. They got into the closet, or at least she did, and her son. And she was thinking all kinds of horrible thoughts of kidnapping, which would actually be adoption. They don't kidnap adults; they abduct you. So she was saying it was kidnapping. No, it would be being abducted. She said that was a false alarm, but Jill was still worried. Her family visited for Christmas that year into El Salvador, even though the violence was so endemic. I find that's true with a lot of these evangelical Christians. They think there's nothing wrong to going in these places, that Jesus is going to protect them. And I think that's kind of foolish. Don't go places that the State Department has at a level 4 do not visit. Just don't do it. It's not safe. I argue with people all the time on Reddit in the travel sections. They're all going, "Oh, I went to El Salvador, Nicaragua. It was so awesome. It's not dangerous." Listen, you dum-dum. I see the local news all the time. Nicaragua got so bad and so violent that Costa Rica put in an overseas ferry to take truckers past Nicaragua because the expense and the hassle at the border to get them to elsewhere in Central America. Okay. So Jill said it was very difficult to do fundraising from so far away, and that people criticized them for the fundraising while the show was making money. Now, I remember this because this is one of the times that Without a Box of Kleenex inserted herself and started beating the drums saying that they were scamming people. And it's always been kind of funny that she did that because she's talked to Derek and says nice things about Derek and Jill sometimes, and says really ugly things too. So Derek, at that point, he wanted to let everybody know that they did not get paid from the show at all. They made nothing. He wanted to do that, but Jill was afraid. She was afraid what would happen with her father, with Jim Bob, that if they revealed they were making nothing, that it would not go well for them. So between brainless idiots like Without a Box of Kleenex, beating the drums saying they're ripping people off, and Jill not allowing Derek to share the reality of they weren't getting paid for the show, it just made for a really tight financial time for them. And I thought it was the most interesting chapter to me so far because when the Duggars were down there visiting Jill and Derek, Derek opened the discussion of money and the show, and it didn't go well. Okay? Because of the unsustainability of their fundraising. Derek started talking to Jim Bob about it one night. Jim Bob said the show is a ministry, it's not a money-making operation. So every time that Derek would ask Jim Bob a question or make a statement, Jim Bob would try to deflect him onto something else. But Derek kept asking him money show questions, questions about the money, questions about the show. And Jim Bob kept responding with ministry words, with babbling about it, how it's a huge, huge, huge ministry to the world. They were getting millions of people and that sort of thing. A real slimy answer, a very deflecting answer. And then Derek asked this question. Well, how about us receiving a certain percentage of what comes in? They found out in that moment that Josh had gotten paid, at least for a short while. So they had been paying Josh to be on the show, but they weren't paying anyone else. And it wasn't for that long, apparently. Said, Pops kept changing the subject. Well, I am not surprised. That's what controlling folks want to do. And here's what he asked Derek that just breaks my heart. What are you worth? $10 an hour? 12. That's what I pay some of the others who work for me. So that was just very dismissive of Jim Bob to even say that and try to put that value on Derek when Derek had actually held a legitimate job working in accounting with Walmart national headquarters before they went down to El Salvador. Okay? He was dismissive and insulting in that remark. And Derek refused to back down. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad that Derek seems to have more backbone and more morals than anything than 1,000 Jim Bob Duggars. So Jim Bob kept on with his babbling about ministry and more children are a blessing. And she said that her father was rattled and he was mad. He was PO'd. And his excuse was this. But we are reaching more people through the show than you are here on the mission field. Oh my gosh. How could he even say that to his son-in-law? That's just awful. So Jill said she was just cringing away the whole time. I can imagine because money discussions are never comfortable. I don't like to have them with people that aren't my little circle of my family. I really don't. And even with my husband, I don't always like having those kind of conversations. And I'm going to say this. In retirement, we have been blessed to have more than enough coming in. And that's all I'm interested in with money. I'm not interested in being a billionaire. I just want to be comfortable. And we are. So that's about it. So Jill started having more and more anxiety attacks, which is unfortunate. Anxiety attacks are really the worst at the pits. And it's a rather bizarre cultural clash, I think, too. Cultural clash and generational clash. Jim Bob Duggar, like myself, is on the cusp of the baby boom generation. Jill and Derek are not. They are more millennials, I think. And Jill was not good at this point at making her own needs known. She had been raised to put Jesus, others, yourself. We used to talk about that in my old church, and that is a terrible way to live. That is a terrible thing to do to your kids, to put that in them. If you don't know how to stand up for yourself, a bunch of stuff is going to happen to you that's negative. If you don't know how to say, hey, these are my needs, this is what needs to happen. I'm not always good at that. Coming out of these CULT churches, you aren't, because it's what you've been taught. So Jill said that she meditated on the scripture where children ask their father for bread. And does a father hand them a snake or does he hand them bread? The scriptures say even a bad father will give their children bread if they're asking for it. So that changed her entire mindset about her father and how he was acting over money. And it is pretty shocking when you start looking at the scriptures she's citing to think that Jim Bob was denying them funding. And they were an important part of the show. So while there started to be more deaths and much more gang violence. She shared some stories of the gang violence and people who disappeared and families told not to look for them. Just some really scary stuff. And then TLC does something that to my mind is it's outrageous. They took out ransom insurance on Jill and Derek. And that's not to say that ransoms don't happen in Central America, because in places like El Salvador, they sure do. They sure do. And it got to the point where they were living in their ministry and everything, that it was only white people were left. Because everybody who was El Salvadorian who had turned down the gangs, turned down membership in MS-13 and these other gangs was suddenly disappeared. She said the gangs left Christians like them, white Christian missionaries alone. They just never tried to hurt them in any way, shape, or form. Then TLC wanted them to go to Houston to film with the other kids and said that they had the exact same staff on the new show as they had on the old show and the same people. Jill and Derek said no, they weren't going to Houston to film. They were very sorry, but they had too much going on in El Salvador and they had made the commitment not to leave until July. Even though it sounds like it might have been wise to go ahead and leave. You know, I know somebody's working in ministry like they're describing here in Nicaragua, and I cannot tell you the horror stories that Pastor Skippy has told me. I call him Pastor Skippy because he looks like a Pastor Skippy. Has told me about the Nicaraguan government, the harassment they've encountered, the things that have gone down. Whenever we give money to that ministry, we have to give it to them in their hand in cash here in Costa Rica in US dollars, okay? Because to receive that same money in Nicaragua, like to be wired in a bank account like we do here, the Nicaraguan government would seize it. And I don't doubt in El Salvador with similar things going on when they were there. Everybody, and when the nation is corrupt, everybody has their hand out trying to collect money. I was talking the other day about the Saudis want to build a waterway here to rival the Panama Canal because the Panama Canal is over busy. The water levels are down. There's like a 10 to 15 day wait to take your boat in. Expenses are crazy. So the Saudis wanted to build this thing in Costa Rica. They want to build it from Limon, the Port of Limon, and go somewhere north of here in Guanacaste, right where the parks are, I think. Federal parks like the Parque de Santa Rosa. And I'm looking at this going, not a good idea, because the history of Costa Rica and these building projects from foreign countries has not been good. Costa Rica, it recognized Taiwan. Taiwan built this Friendship of Taiwan Bridge. 3 years later, Costa Rica said, oh, we're not recognizing you anymore. We got the bridge. Too bad, so sad. Now we're recognizing China, and China's putting in this massive football stadium for us, soccer stadium. And not only that, the way TICOs work is not going to go, it's not going to fit well with the Saudis' way of doing things. I just don't see it working at all. TICOs are laid back. They do things at their own gosh darn time. They take breaks when they want. And they take shortcuts. I'm dealing again with my air conditioner. I was fussing earlier, a week or so earlier, I had a guy out to fix it. And he said, well, I just pounded on the part a few times and it's working. Well, guess what? It's not working right now. So the TICO tendency to take the easiest way out is going to bite them in the rear end if they try to put this thing in. Not to mention the fact that the history of when Americans tried to put railroads here did not work because of TICO workmen and people running off with the money. So I think that there's a possibility that the Saudis are going to get burned if they try to do this, and it's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a cluster, you know what. But the reason I'm sharing this is to share that in Central America, things are different. They work differently, and you can't really depend upon people to do things right the first time unless you stand over them. And there's violence in various parts. There's this different culture altogether that I was worried for Jill when she moved to El Salvador, even though I hadn't moved to Costa Rica yet, because I knew the culture was different. I'd been down here before. And an international move is not easy. And I got to give Jill credit for that because it's definitely not easy. I have experienced that firsthand myself a number of times. So we have all this going on, and somebody by the name of Alice has now come out. who is supposedly talking to without a box of Kleenex, and supposedly Alice is the one that wrote Oprah the letter that said, don't use the Duggars because Jim Bob Duggar is covering up for his son. Supposedly that's who's come out and talked to without a box of Kleenex. I don't buy it. I don't believe it. I believe it when I see this person, this Alice, come forward and talk about all this stuff and show her face. That's the only way I would believe it at this rate, because too many times without a box of Kleenex has made up stuff, just left and right and center, and I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it. It's one thing to get things wrong, like Behind the Bastards did with some of the stuff about Josh, a few of the things. They neglected to mention a few of them. And it's okay. But when you start making things up again, and you're one of those people where you just continually made up stuff, just taken a little tiny rumor and spun it into whole cloth like it is really something instead of a rumor, is awful. Awful people do that. And she has a tendency to do that. So I'm not paying attention to this. She is feasting on the Duggars right now. She has said a bunch of ugly things about Jill because Jill did not detail any of the abuse that she suffered. Who would? Nobody would. Nobody would say, this is what was done to me. This is how we did it. This is how long it went on. This is what it means. All of that. None of that. None of that. None of that occurred at all. So just be real careful where you're getting your Duggar news from, because some people just make it the heck up. Okay, I'm gonna go. As you can tell, I'm rambling. I'm full of drugs. I'm full of bougie water. Thank you for watching, and I hope to be able to go live soon. I hope that this stupid internet works. Taco Tuesday will not take place tomorrow because I'll be walking the border to Nicaragua, and since the bridge is out, I have an extra hour on my trip to get there. So that ought to be interesting and fun. Fun, 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 fun. And then I'm going to try to get my iPad fixed, which is another thing in and of its own. Okay, I'll see you guys later.